it seems a decisive move in your argument that you take religion, you want to include religion in the debate of multicultural religion, and therefore it seems to be decisive to take it as sort of comparable to ethnicity, not only in identity marker which is chosen, but somehow is scripted. On the other hand side, it's important in almost every religion that conversion is possible. You can decide to be a believer of Christianity, of Judaism, of Islam, and so on. And there's quite an important discussion going on what is so decisive, what is so special with religion. And obviously, it is really necessary that to take religion to be primordial or an descriptive marker of an identity. On the other hand side, there's this tension with conversion and to take a decision to be Christian, or to be a Muslim, and so on. And my question is, so what is so special on religion to include it in a debate on multiculturalism, but not, for example, political parties, socialism, and so on? Is it really this aspect that it's not only chosen? This more or less the most important question for me.
Yeah, well, perhaps I can add it. In the Netherlands, this is a type of argument that you often hear from liberals who say, well, anti-Semitism is clearly focusing on an descriptive identity. You can't choose to be a Jew. You're born a Jew. Jew is an ethnicity, well, although it's at the same time religion. Yeah. And they claim that Islam is very different. Islam is something that you choose for and that you not carry along with you as a burden, like the Jew carries his Jewish identity.
But it's not only Islam, it's a religious identity, and explicitly religious. It's also Christian identity.
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, your question was, well, what's the feature about religion that gets included in my family of multicultural identities, but not, say, political parties or political ideologies like socialism? Okay. I mean, you saw at the very beginning that I borrowed something from Iris Marion Young about the concept of equality, and I talked about difference. Because of time, I didn't really have a chance to say much about what does difference mean. I just put it in and hoped there would be some kind of understanding about it, some minimum understanding about it. But the difference that I'm interested in, and that I think multiculturalism is interested in, is difference where people are treated unfavorably and in ways that denies quality and equal respect. So this difference can be ascriptive, but it doesn't have to be, well, it's not only ascriptive. The sense of difference can come, as it were, from inside the identity bearer, the difference bearer. It doesn't have to be completely from outside. And in most of the examples, this is the case. So with the example that you mentioned, an ethnic identity, there are features of an ethnic identity that are imposed on a group, so that in Britain, for instance, we had an identity grow up, well, it still exists, but it's not so salient, which we called Asian. Right. And Asian basically meant South Asian, meaning from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and so on. And there's a sense in which Asians didn't know they were Asians till they were told, because they thought they were Pakistanis, possibly just Punjabis or Gujaratis or something like that. But a discourse arose which said, you know, I'm talking about Asians. Some Asians may have participated in that discourse, and then others would have picked it up and embraced it. And in fact, this is what happened. So we had, in particular, I would say, younger people, British-born, you know, second-generation people of that descent, quite liked it, because they could then talk about kind of Asian music and Asian films and Asian novels that dealt with Asian themes and so on, like, say, Salman Rushdie and Hanif Qureshi and so on. So they quite liked it, and they liked the fact that it it offered an identity that didn't immediately root them or connect them to forms of identities, say, that their parents were necessarily trying to transmit, that they may have thought were conservative in some respects, possibly to do with religion, but also to do with regional norms of living and so on, like how you marry, who you marry, and so on. So that's, now given that I'm interested in identities which lead to, or are leading to, negative treatment, then, negative, and there is this element of choice and description, then being a member of the Labour Party, it's not obvious that it fits into that category. Okay, well, I mean, okay, no one's doing any research to show that there is stigmatization and exclusion and job discrimination and discrimination in the housing market and so on if you're a Labour Party member. Most people don't even know who's a Labour Party member unless they're on television or something. So it's going to be a tiny, tiny proportion of people. That's how I would begin. And I think that religion, as we are witnessing it today in relation to the minority religions of non-European origins, like Hinduism and Islam and Sikhism and so on, fits the model very well, because we have discrimination, we have stereotyping, so we have various kinds of social ascription where, for instance, Muslims are thought to be dangerous, extremists, likely to blow people up and so on. At the same time, you have the self-identity as well, where people say, I'm Muslim and I'm proud of it, or I'm Muslim and it's the most important thing about me. And I perhaps add that as well, that it's an identity that people want to assert, which they think others are obscuring or negativizing, and making invisible, or making it an identity that typically one should be ashamed of, not proud of. And so I think religion falls into that category, and Islam falls into that category as it were 1000%. So that I think what's happening in Europe is a racialization, or like ethnicization, of Muslim identities, of exactly the kind that is, but not exactly the kind, that would be an exaggeration, of a kind that we can see is an echo of say, something that happened in Bosnia. Obviously, not the violence in terms of ethnic cleansing and so on, but where some, Bosnian Serbs said, they're Serbs, they're Croats, you are Muslims. And a religious identity was picked out to mark a group of people who then had to be treated in a certain kind of way. And I think that this is happening in Western Europe, not the ethnic cleansing necessarily, but the racialization, the group formation, the negativeness of the group formation, and so on.
Thank you.
I just want to add a small thing, but that isn't your concept of multiculturalism not to overcome this unproductive distinction between ascriptive and achieved. This is precisely what it's all about. I would say that whether when we ascribe certain positions to people, it blocks them, it hinders them in a way to be what they want to be, and I think that's precisely what I find attractive to your concept of multiculturalism. It's overcoming this distinction.
No, thanks. That's a helpful point. How I put it in the book is that the multiculturalism is about turning a negative difference into a positive difference, as opposed to, say, making the difference invisible. But if the difference disappears over time, because being Jewish, I think, is a difference that could disappear. It hasn't quite disappeared, but we can easily hypothesize how it no longer may have any major political and social salience. So of course Jewish people would be a community marked in certain ways amongst themselves. But anyway, one can hypothesize certain differences could disappear. But given the problems that we have about negative difference, I think a strategy of identifying that fact is important, and you can't identify it on a colorblind strategy. So you have to then deploy all these concepts and policies that follow with them and so on. And I think that the broad program of affirming those identities, if people want them, and that means that there has to be that chosen element. If they were purely ascriptive, then obviously I wouldn't want to see those affirmed. In fact, I'm very much, do you remember the point I made in the talk about the importance of respecting the identities that people say are important to them? And in Britain, we've had Martin mentioned, there's been a kind of what you might call identity drift, or terminology shifts. Because we used to talk about black people, then we said black and Asian, then we said ethnic minorities, and now we say Muslims for the most part, and a few others, yeah, you know. So I think that what's interesting is that those shifts that I've just mentioned actually have been driven by the subject groups themselves. We moved from black to black and Asian, not because some bureaucrats thought this is a good idea or some politicians did, but because a lot of Asian people said, black is not our identity. And so they went for an identity Asian, which had a particular British context, as I was explaining earlier. So you could say, well, you know, they chose something that already had a certain kind of social meaningfulness, partly on a kind of ascribed basis. But they chose it, that's the point. And I think that respecting identities that people say are important to them is a critical part of multiculturalism.
I have a question about, well, my question has two parts. One is, why do you dismiss the epistemological multiculturalism, and how does, well, I think the epistemological multiculturalism is very much linked to your issue of the implications of multiculturalism in terms of the kind of identities that you talked about. Because if you are saying that it goes beyond descriptive identities or more the essentialized identities in terms of biology and culture, then shouldn't we discuss then the issue of epistemological multiculturalism?
I wanted to write a book that didn't take 5 years. So, you know, learned a lesson from Thijl. And because I was obviously, like you know, most of us, I guess, in the room, very concerned with what was happening in the world. Namely, that we were moving to a period of fear. Everyone was getting frightened, and they were frightening each other. The politicians talking about war on terror, and the media hounding Muslims as, you know, dangerous people. So I wanted to restate multiculturalism because I thought that it had been completely caricatured. It had been obviously very, very politically damaged. I wanted to see if I could help to rescue it, to restore that. And so I had very much a political motive. And so I just thought, what is the easiest, intellectually the easiest, and in terms of writing and so on, the quickest way of doing this and getting a book out, which might help, you know, somewhere around. I mean, if you like, this is a kind of naive ambition, but I do have this ambition. I don't see my academic work as something, oh, I just do this because I'd like to get an article in a journal and hope that at least 6 other people might read it in the next 5 years. And I thought the best way to do that was to, as it were, travel as light as one can. So to take out anything that is not absolutely necessary to defend a certain conception of political multiculturalism. So in the book, I take an agnostic view about what one might call epistemological multiculturalism, or some kind of view, you know, on like Taylor on hermeneutics, or sort of, you know, borrowing from Gadamer's idea of fusion of horizons, or certain kinds of post-colonial critiques of Eurocentrism and so on. I leave all of those to one side because it was far too difficult for me to kind of study them all, take a view, write a reasoned view, and anyway, who was going to read it, given my purpose? So, as it happens, since I wrote the book and so on, I've actually come to the view that probably I do need to take epistemological side of things more seriously, as well as the ethical side probably more seriously as well. But what I tried to do in the book was to just, as it were, separate out the politics from the larger and more difficult philosophical questions, both because they were difficult and couldn't be done in a hurry by me anyway, and because of the political purpose, which meant that I wanted to get something out quickly, and I wanted to get something out that people interested in the political issues would read and possibly have an impact, so the book should be relatively short and accessible and so on. And I've already been criticised by some people that I was hoping to reach by being told that including just one chapter on social theory and essentialism is making my book inaccessible. When I say, well, what about all the other chapters? Skip that one, you know. But because I did feel I needed a rejoinder to some pretty strong and standard social theory critiques about essentialism and reification and so on. So I do have a chapter in the book about that. So you're quite right that I wouldn't use the word dismiss. In the book, all I say is I'm bracketing off these issues because I want to concentrate on those. The other thing I do very briefly, which might relate to some thoughts that other people have, questions that other people have, is, and it relates to a conversation I was having with someone over coffee. I assume a liberal democratic context. So I don't defend it, I don't articulate it, because people say to me somewhere, well, you say so much about groups and what groups should be entitled to, but what about individual rights? You know, I've got about 2 sentences on individual rights, saying basically, A, they're a good thing, and B, I'm now talking about something else. So, you know, I assume quite a lot of contemporary normative and contemporary institutional backdrop. And what I try to do is to rescue multiculturalism and show that it can fit within that backdrop, rather than, as it's been characterized by other people, as something which is alien to liberal democratic political context.
My question is related to what you said about the identities. You know, I mean, as I understood, and if it is correct, multiculturalism is less discriminative towards some groups of people, towards some identities, compared to secularism, as you said. So, but still the question is less discriminative towards which identity exactly? Because as you said, I mean, if you consider the individual identity, the multiculturalism would be, you know, empowering collective identity, while on the other hand, maybe would be disempowering individual identity. But then, is it true actually that maybe, yeah, this means somehow empowering the collective identity like Muslim groups or Muslim identities, but disempowering some other groups, like for example Muslim identities within these groups. Take the example of the France, you know, veiling case. That in some cases actually the women, you know, have been forced to put on veiling and you know, because of the pressure of the family or these kind of things. So this is my question. Are you defending the kind of, you know, collective, less discrimination towards collective identity, or And in that case, what would happen to individual identity? I'm Fatem, I'm coming from Iran and also grew up in a religious family, but still, this is very interesting for me to, I mean, this discussion of multiculturalism, but still, because, I have studied different materials on the veiling in France and contestations and all controversies about this issue. I'm asking this because there's always a problem to choose between, secularism, because it's important for some people, but then multiculturalism and to choose between.
Okay, well, I think the first step I take to answering that question is to make a certain conceptual point about groups, and then I make a kind of sociological point or possibly a political point. The conceptual point I make, in the book and generally is we, in fact, even in social theory, people have oversimplified, in order to criticize multiculturalism, they've oversimplified what we mean by a group, what we should mean by a group, what we actually, if we, I have a kind of philosophical background with Wittgenstein, and so, attending to language use as a way of trying to understand the nuances of a concept is a kind of a methodological approach for it. So it seems to me that if we actually look at how people talk about groups, their own and others, we don't have anything like we don't always have anything like a simple univocal concept. Sometimes people talk like that, but other times there's quite a lot of diversity. So the first point I make is that we should understand the idea of a group, not as, in terms of, as philosophers might say, sufficient and necessary conditions. A group must have A, B, and C. When you've got it, you're a group. When you haven't got it, you're not. I want to say there are different kinds of groups. So for instance, some of the groups that I'm interested in are groups which require, not by force, well sometimes by force unfortunately as well, but which on the whole their group norms require endogamy. Other groups, endogamy is not a big issue, like so for instance you can be black in Britain and so on, and some black people will say, you should marry another black person and so on. They certainly used to say that about 10 years ago, but given how black people themselves have behaved and, crossed racial boundary lines when it comes to dating and partnering and marriage and so on, it's not a strong argument. So here's another idea of a group, which, one can be a member of a group and not be, one's membership is not doubted because one has a white partner. So I want to say that groups can be quite different, and we'd still call them groups of the relevant kind, of the difference marked groups that I'm interested in. And so that's the conceptual point. Then the political question arises, and I want to take and I do take a view that how groups are represented should itself be done in a diverse way. So we shouldn't, if you like, have the French model, that a group representation requires membership of a supreme kind of national council, high national council, and if you're not on that, somehow you're not represented. And that's the one and only place where you get represented. I want to say that we should look at different mechanisms for representation. Sometimes being on a state-constructed council, or being in the House of Lords, might be appropriate. I don't want to rule it out, but I don't want to say either that if you're in the House of Lords, that's it, you're represented, forget about everything else, that becomes less important. Nor do I want to say that the model of the House of Lords representation or some kind of state council representation, which is very much a kind of show me your leader type model of representation, that is the model of representation that should happen elsewhere. So to use an example that I used about the BBC, when I say that Muslims are underrepresented in the BBC, I don't simply mean, oh, they're not talking to the National Muslim Association, but they're not talking to enough Muslims anyway. And they should be employing Muslims, and they should be having Muslims as part of program makers as well as consultatives and so on. And I also argue, which is an extension of this point, that representation should not simply be seen as something which the state does, but that the burden of representation has to be shared across civil society. So universities, the voluntary sector, employers, churches, political parties, these are all places where issues about representation should arise, and on the whole are arising. Universities are asking themselves, well, we live in a multicultural city or a multicultural part of a city. Are we doing enough to represent ourselves within our environment, either in terms of our student population or in terms of our board of governors or in terms of possibly the courses that we offer and so on. So it can be at many different levels. So if the BBC said, here are some Muslims that we are talking to about making some interesting programs, and some of them wear the headscarf and some others don't, and some of them belong to a Muslim organizations and others don't. They're just people who have articulate views that we can learn from, that we want to be in dialogue with. I mean, all those could be good reasons for representation. So I don't want to see everything in terms of a simple model, because the simple model would suffer in the way that is implicit in your question, because it would allow one particular Muslim identity to be privileged over others. So we might say, oh, to be a Muslim, you either have to have a beard or a headscarf. If you haven't got one of those, you're not a Muslim, and so on. So, nor do I want some other people privileging some other Muslim identity that says, oh, to be an intelligent, educated Muslim means you don't wear a headscarf because you've gone beyond that, you're an emancipated woman and so on. That, I think, is extremely divisive. It sets one set of Muslims against others, and it's not democratic. Democratic is trying to bring in lots of different kinds of voices, not using just a singular model of representation.
Edith?
My name is Edith. I'm a fellow at ISIM. Thank you for both of the speakers. I would like to ask a question to Professor Modood, and I'm wishing to ask my questions other speakers some other time since he's here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This racialization and not including religion into the discourse, I think it's something very particular to the British way of making politics. In Europe, we have different cases, especially in Dutch case, we have religion already included into the political discourse, but there is a special reservation about Islam still. Why, I don't know, maybe you may like to make some comments on that. But my question is, taking religion as a political category for those religious people who like to carry their identity into public sphere, yeah, that's good, but what would be allowed to be taken to the public sphere and what is not welcome? What is welcome, what is not welcome? When we are asking these questions, still in Europe, in the political discourse, in intellectual discourse, people say that, okay, Islam is welcome, Muslims are welcome, but to some extent. If Islam is, if European Islam, for example, is welcome. There are good Islam, bad Islam. And who will decide that? I mean, that's very normative question, and who construct these norms are, the established culture in Western Europe, whatever it is. So I'm not really sure about your, accepting this religion into the discourse would solve the problem.
Well, I would have to agree that the way that we in Britain talk about race is quite distinctive to us. So we have borrowed it to some extent from the United States, but we've indigenized it. The way we end up talking about it, they don't in the United States. So, for instance, we say Asian, meaning Indians and Pakistanis, are part of the race relations framework that anti-racial discrimination legislation applies to them and so on. Whereas that's not what people in the United States understand by race. They think race is black or white, and then the others become ethnic minorities. But we talk about ethnic minorities as well. But as I said to you in passing, we first make a racial divide mentally, if not actually, and then we insert ethnicity. So only people who are not white have an ethnicity, in the British kind of way of thinking. So I don't want to, and so I can see why you might feel that the process, the term racialization is, oh well, this is just Brits talking about Britain. They've not got a proper grip about what's happening in the rest of the continent and so on. But but then you went on to make the point that the Netherlands is able to include groups marked by religion, defined by religion, and has already done so. But Muslims are a bit of an exception, and you asked me to speculate or comment on that. Well, I would say that actually the making of Muslims an exception is a part of the process of racialization, because it's saying you are a group, which the group itself might echo back saying, yes, indeed we are. Though of course there will be some people who say, no, you're reifying us and marginalizing us and so on. So, so Dutch society may say to Muslims, you are a group. Many Muslims echo back, yes, we are a group, thank you at last for recognizing us. But you're a bad group, so you can't have some of the things that other groups can have and so on. Well, you are a bad group, and you are a group, and you're a bad group is exactly the kind of thing that I mean by racialization. I suppose you could say, strictly speaking, racialization should have something to do with phenotypical features. But on the whole, it does. I mean, I readily agree.
Is it the phenotypical feature?
Well, brown skin is pretty critical. I mean, of course, there are converts, blonde, blue-eyed Muslims from Scotland and so on, and Muslims can look quite diverse, but how they actually look and the racialization don't have to perfectly match, because the racialization is basically, well, if you look Asian or Arab, you're a Muslim. Some of you will be aware that some anti-Muslim violent attacks, especially some following 9/11 in the United States, the first attacks, in fact it was a murder, was on a Sikh. Because he was a Sikh who had a turban, he had a turban and a beard. So, and, well, he looked a bit like Osama bin Laden. But he was a Sikh, he wasn't a Muslim, and, we don't even know what he thought about Muslims. He may have thought, they worship a false god and smell. But because he looked like a Muslim, so that's partly what I mean by racialization. I don't know how strongly committed I want to be to the phenotypical baseline. I guess I probably am. I think there has to be some kind of physical appearance, but I wouldn't want to make it too strongly biological. I think as long as someone's able to identify a group on the basis of physical appearance, or if you like, misidentify, but think they can identify a group, as long as they feel there are certain features that lend themselves to group identification, visible group identification, I would say I probably want to use racialization, or possibly qualify it by calling it quasi-racialization, or semi-racialization, or neo-racialization, or something like that. But basically, I'd make the concept of racialization go further than simply connected to biology. Your last point about, well, of course, if we get into a discourse that some Muslims are okay, others are bad Muslims, who decides. I know that there's been quite a lot of critical work, and for that matter also political argument, kind of against the idea of good Muslim, bad Muslim. And I myself was just saying 2 minutes ago that I certainly don't think we should follow policies that divide Muslims up and set Muslims against each other and so on. But nevertheless, I don't personally feel as hostile to the idea that there are good Muslims and there are bad Muslims as some people in the literature do. I mean, I'm talking now about politics. You know, I'm not particularly concerned here about faith and the observance of faith and so on. Given what I've said about multiculturalism and how strongly committed I am to it, and here I am advocating it, and so on, and that its political cultural context is liberal democratic institutions and liberal democratic norms, it'd be very difficult for me to approve of people who are against multiculturalism and liberal democratic norms. So, if they're Hindu or Christian, I would approve. I wouldn't approve of them. So if they're Muslims, I wouldn't approve of them. And as a matter of fact, I don't think most Muslims fall into that category. So it's not a major problem for me. But some do, either through their ideological discourse, in which case I would argue with them, or through their actions, in which case I would want to curb those actions, whether by law or in some other ways. So, who decides? Well, we all decide in one form or another, because these can be democratic issues if we're talking about people who are attacking the roots of democratic multiculturalism.
My name is Hanna van Ooyen, and I'm doing a PhD research on religious manifestations by public servants. And thank you both for your presentations, also of course for Professor Modood. And also specifically on the question why it is exactly religion that's being privatized in the secularist discourse. If I'm not mistaken, one of the assumptions underlying this idea is that in the public debate you need some sort of secular argument so as to understand each other, because if you're religious you might have some sort of argument that a non-religious person would not understand. And I think there are three premises that go with that, and I wonder to what extent these premises could be clarifying or maybe an answer to the question why it is exactly religion that is argued to be privatized. And the first is that religion is of course something spiritual. It relates to something which cannot be grabbed, not rational, and at the same time it does encompass some sort of general idea about how society could look. For instance, you could have some sort of ideas about abortion or euthanasia, and you could sustain that with religious arguments, which is being done in the Netherlands sometimes. And the argument could be that religious arguments could not support that, because non-religious persons could not understand such an argument. So other than, for instance, gay communities, religious person might promulgate some sort of vision on society, one. Secondly, they do this in a non-rational way. And thirdly, third premise, which might be most arguable, is that religion, other than homosexuality or race or whatever, seeks to proselytize. I'm not saying that all religious persons seek to proselytize, but there could be one argument.
Proselytize.
Proselytize, to convert the other people.
I have a question about your interpretation about secularism, and I would like to connect it a bit to the subject of this lecture series, post-secular. In your paper, you were talking about institutional secularism and ideological secularism, and in your book, you actually talk about moderate secularism and radical secularism, probably rather similar. So I would like to ask you why you use these divisions of secularism. We've kind of, in our reading group, came to see a difference between secularism and secular. which means that we would probably be more critical towards secularism. So my question would be, why do you choose these divisions and kind of stay within secularism, even though you have so much criticism also on secularism?
My question is about the limits of liberalism. And in a sense, I could just make a joke out of saying, well, who cares really about multiculturalism? And who is really so against it that we have to put on a big fight for it? I can think of one block of individuals who are solidly in favor of multiculturalism and are actually going to war for it, and that is advanced capitalism as a whole. If by multiculturalism we mean a mix and match of diverse cultural practices, fusion cooking, a voluptuous woman with curly hair and mercifully free of Lutheran or Calvinist guilt, and that sort of MTV model. So is there not a sense in which multiculturalism is too safe an option? And why are you so determined to fight this? I suppose this is a question coming from the left that could be addressed to any liberal model. And to make it more specific, because we've looked at your book very carefully in our group, I'm very worried about how in the name of this, your notion of multiculturalism, you dismiss, in my opinion, very hastily the much beloved Stuart Hall and his model of the new multiple ethnicities, this page 107 and 108, where you dismiss simultaneously multiplicity of ethnicities, and either it smacks of your fear of relativism, I can feel it there, and also identifications. You seem to be, there's something about identifications, and that's too complicated a question to be
I might just say a couple of words about post-secular as a way of kind of then saying what I think about secularism and why I divide secularism perhaps in one way as opposed to another. I have a certain nervousness about post-secular. I certainly agree that there are important changes taking place in our society about a certain taken for granted secularism, a kind of almost unquestioned hegemony around one interpretation or another of secularism. I mean, nobody thought it was a political issue. Everybody thought it was kind of dead. It had been won decades ago, if not generations ago. And everybody was moving in that direction. Now, of course, we see not just academics talking about it, but it's now part of the political kind of ferment. So in that sense, post-secular is right. We moved from kind of a secularist hegemony to challenges, questions, interrogations of that hegemony. That's absolutely right. But sometimes when people use that term and that label, they then begin to characterize contemporary societies as post-secular. And I don't think we are post-secular societies. We're societies where secularism is dominant, but there are challenges to it. And Muslims in particular are a very visible feature of that challenge, but there are other challenges as well, including Christians, some Christians, and so on. So we have some post-secular currents, but we don't have post-secular societies, which is a bit like how I feel about Stuart Hall's new ethnicities, that we do indeed have some new ethnicities, but they're not wiping out the old ethnicities, they exist as well. And so I guess I feel Stuart Hall, or Stuart Hall actually less so, and I do say in this book, I mean, because I've learned a lot from Stuart Hall, I have great respect for him and his work. It's very inspiring and suggestive and seminal. But some people have taken new ethnicities to mean, oh, this is now what exists. Old ethnicities, whatever they may be, well, that's all stupid old stuff that anthropologists might do somewhere else, but we don't do it here, because we have new ethnicities. So it's the overgeneralization that I was objecting to in relation to Stuart Hall. And So given that's my general view, that we still live in secularist societies, and I don't really see that as changing, the question is about challenges, about adaptations, and about, which secularisms. Then, your question about why do I draw the line in one place as another becomes important. And I'll get to that perhaps by answering the first question about why some people might think that the strongest or one secularist argument is about that religion or argument based on religion cannot live up to some basic requirements of public reasoning and public argument. I mean, this is an argument, as I'm sure you're aware, but perhaps not everybody else is, that's really very strongly associated with American political theory, and in particular with certain rule theories. Though Habermas has a version of it as well, actually. Well, I don't agree with most of the stronger interpretations of it. I think they're far too restrictive and anti-democratic, because they're telling people to shut up. You may want to talk like that, but the rest of us can't understand you, so please don't talk like that. Stop talking. Well, why? If non-religious people can't understand religious people, they should ask for an explanation. Say, please, will you clarify? Just as Martin did in relation to Thijl and I at the end of our talks. Anything not understood, please ask for clarification. That is democratic debate. That is democratic dialogue. If someone says to me, we must have higher pensions because it's the will of God, I might say, I'm sorry, I don't understand that. What's the connection? Could you explain it to me? I might even say, what do you mean, will of God? I don't understand that. I might even say I don't understand pensions, but whatever it is, that's what we do. We ask for clarification. We join in the debate. We make an effort to understand, and that is a basic requirement of civic solidarity. We don't say, you're religious, please shut up, or talk to us in our terms. Here's the terms that we do understand. We shouldn't tell other people what terms they should talk in. Maybe they don't understand us, and we have to explain ourselves to them. So that is dialogue. That is conversations which may lead somewhere.
I think the point is that you may understand each other, but still not recognize the will of other people's thought.
Well, I mean, in the end, we have to take decisions about, in a democracy, who we're voting for, what laws should be passed, and so on. I certainly would want to discourage people from making decisions that, to use my example, that moved from the will of God to pensions in one go. I'd say, well, it may be the will of God that elderly people should not be destitute. I agree with that, but look, let's look at our welfare system as a whole. Let's look at how much money there is to spend. Let's divide it. Don't you think it's also important to put some money into nursery education and so on? So that way the argument moves quite quickly, a long way away from the will of God. But I don't say to that person, don't talk to me about the will of God. That was my point. So the argument that we don't understand religious people and therefore they must speak in our terms, I think is quite arrogant and anti-democratic. Religion is non-rational. Well, I don't know whether I fully understand that. Of course, there are aspects of religion that aspects of faith, like I suppose like belief in God or what God is, that are the ultimate foundations of the rest of the reasoning that a religious person might offer. But they offer loads of reasons. I mean, gosh, we've got divinity departments, theology departments full of reasoning, and a lot of it that we're no longer interested in, fair enough. But of course religious people reason all the time, just as Marxists reason, and they use all kinds of concepts I don't understand when they say false consciousness or the inevitability of the victory of the proletariat and so on. I don't know what they're talking about. So, but I do ask for an explanation. I don't say, I don't understand what you're talking about, that's the end of the conversation. So I'm not sure that I'm convinced by non-rational. They may believe in something that I don't believe in and I don't understand, but there's lots of reasoning that follows after that. Just like my pension example. We argued, we say to them, but look, how can we afford greater pension when we've got an economic recession, etc., etc. So rational argument will always come in. And thirdly, you're proselytizing. Well, what's wrong with proselytizing? I'm not sure what the objection is. Sorry? Yeah, I mean, are secular people allowed to proselytize? Because they seem to be doing a pretty good job. And of course, secular people, and I include myself as a secular person, we're divided in all kinds of things. We disagree about multiculturalism, we might disagree about human rights, we might disagree about pensions, and so on. So, if by proselytizing, trying to convert someone from one ism to another, or from one kind of group to another group, well, we do that in non-religious contexts. I don't see that it's wrong in itself if we do it in a religious context. There'll be ways of doing it that I will certainly believe are wrong. So that if there are cults that get young people who are kind of lonely and feeling very insecure and so on, and then take them to some kind of place where they're not allowed to sleep but have to believe in the semi-divinity of the group leader and so on, and have to wash that person's clothes and 2 weeks later provide them with sex and so on, I might say that's not a good model of conversion. But it's not because conversion is wrong or proselytizing is wrong. So as I say, everything I say is kind of embedded in liberal democratic norms. So as long as conversion can happen within liberal democratic norms, proselytizing can happen within liberal democratic norms, I'd say fine, if they want to do it, let them do it. And if people don't like them, let them counter-proselytize. That's what we normally do. When Marxists come up with a view, we say, oh no, we didn't quite agree with that, here's another view. And that then leads me to why do I divide secularism into moderate and radical secularism, which I also use synonymously with institutional and ideological secularism, as opposed to, say, secularism and secular. Well, I don't know whether I got a worked out answer for that, but I would say that I do believe in secularism myself. I want to argue for a version of secularism against other versions of secularism, as you recognise, moderate secularism. And I would say that if I had to think about the components of what we normally mean by political secularism, I would, well, I can think of three broad arguments. One is the one that we've just had about the importance of public reasoning being accessible to everybody, and I don't accept that, as I guess you have gathered. The other argument is about the privatization of faith, religious faith, and as you can see, I obviously don't accept that. And then the third, which I do accept, is about the differentiation between different kinds of activities and different kinds of authorities. So I want to argue that politics is a different kind of activity to religious activity, to religion. But of course, in our lives, our different activities can overlap and interconnect. So art is different from religion, as is different from politics. Economics, doing business is different from politics, etc., etc., etc. And I think that secularism has become a very important feature of internally differentiated, complex, pluralistic societies, which say religious authority and political authority are two different forms of authority.